The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The marble of Gringotts' wizarding bank was the color of old bone in the August heat. Harry had noticed this on the way in, the way the white stones soaked up the morning sun and gave nothing back, the way the building sat on its corner of Diagon Alley like something that had decided it was permanent before the street around it had finished deciding what it wanted to be. Hagrid had been explaining things the whole way through, his enormous voice calibrated to what he apparently believed was a discrete volume, and Harry had listened with the careful attentiveness of someone who had spent 10 years learning that adults gave you information you needed in the moments they believed they were telling you something else. What he had gathered? There was money. There was a vault. There was something else, something Hagrid had been instructed to collect, and the nervousness with which Hagrid referenced the something else suggested it was the more significant of the two errands. Also, there was going to be an inheritance audit. Hagrid had mentioned this last, almost apologetically, as they approached the bronze doors. Standard procedure, they said. For orphaned wizards. Like when they turn 11. Dumbledore arranged it. He had said Dumbledore's name with the specific quality he always gave it, something between reverence and reassurance, as if the name were a door that opened onto a room where things made sense. Harry nodded and filed the nervousness away. The goblin who received them was very old. Old in the way that creatures with long lifespans were old, where age expressed itself not in frailty, but in a specific quality of stillness, as if he had simply stopped being in any hurry about anything a long time ago. He wore the same uniform as the other tellers, but wore it differently. His family name, Ragnarok, had been carried in this institution across generations, whose count no human record kept accurately. He looked at Harry for a moment longer than transactional courtesy required. Then, at Hagrid. Then, with the expression of someone closing a parenthesis, he said, "The Potter audit. Follow me." The room was small, a table, 2 chairs, a single wall torch burning slightly greener than the ones in the main corridor, and on the table a piece of parchment already unrolled and waiting. Ragnarok sat. Harry sat. Hagrid stood in the doorway and attempted to look unobtrusive, which was something his physical dimensions made structurally impossible. The needle was small and sharp. The drop of blood it produced was small. Harry watched it fall onto the parchment, with the attention he gave to all new experiences. Complete, undramatic, filed for later use. The parchment received the blood. Ink appeared, the Potter family tree, names arriving in ascending order from his parents upward. James, Lily, Nay Evans. Further up, the Potters, 3 generations, respectable and unremarkable. Then the Peverell connection, and the ink slowing as it reached the oldest entries, the way things slowed in deep water. Then Ragnarok produced a second vial. Smaller, the reagent inside was darker than the first. Not quite black, not quite any color Harry had a name for, absorbing the green torchlight rather than reflecting it. The secondary test, Ragnarok said, with a neutrality so complete it was its own form of communication. For dormant lineages, suppressed inheritances, connections that may have been obscured. He added 3 drops. The parchment went still. Then it turned, not darkening gradually, but in a single instant, the way a light went out. From off-white to a black so absolute it seemed to occupy space rather than merely cover it. Obsidian, the black of the inside of a closed fist. The black of something that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time and was now, simply, finally, being seen. In the center of the black, silver ink began to write itself. A crest, the stylized wings of a raven, spread wide. Beneath them a crescent moon, thin as a wire. Bisecting both, a single vertical line, utterly precise, the kind of line that was not decorative but definitional. The crest of the crow. Hagrid made a sound that was not a word. Ragnarok did not make any sound. He pressed something below the desk, and within 30 seconds the door opened and 6 more goblins entered. Then a 7th, older still, moving with the specific pace of someone who had not hurried since the Bronze Age. They looked at the parchment. They did not speak. 15 meters away, through 2 walls and the particular thickness of marble that Gringotts employed specifically because it discouraged both sound and certain categories of magic. A girl with bushy brown hair was sitting very still in an identical chair. Her parchment had completed its first test, the lineage arriving in neat, rapid lines, her parents' names at the bottom, the Granger family ascending in expected Muggle fashion before the ink paused, reconsidered, and proceeded along a divergent branch that her mother's genealogy had never mentioned, and her father's had actively obscured through the casual amnesia of old shame. The secondary reagent had turned her parchment silver. Not the flat silver of ink on white paper, the living silver of a full moon through clear glass, luminous from within. When the parchment in the chamber 15 meters away turned obsidian, she felt it before she saw any reaction in her own. A pressure change, slight and sourceless, the way the air changed before lightning. Then her silver parchment darkened, not to black, but to a deep, saturated gray that was less a color than a relationship between 2 things that had found each other across a wall. The chamber they brought both children to was larger and had been prepared. The senior goblins arranged themselves along the walls with the careful positioning of witnesses at a legal proceeding. Harry and Hermione looked at each other across the chamber's length. He saw a girl with brown hair pulled back unevenly, wearing new robes that fit correctly, but hadn't been worn enough yet to know her. Eyes doing several things simultaneously, cataloging, assessing, cross-referencing against something internal. She saw a boy with glasses that had been repaired many times, wearing new robes that sat on him like something he hadn't decided to inhabit yet. Eyes doing the same things hers were, in a different order. Neither of them said anything. Ragnarok spoke for some time, with the ceremonial precision of a very old creature doing something it had waited very long to do and intended to do exactly correctly. He spoke about Morgana Le Fay, and about division, and about bloodlines that had been running in separate channels for 11 centuries, while the wizarding world above forgot what the channels had been built for. He placed 2 rings on the table, one black, one silver, and explained that they were not jewelry but instruments of magical law, senior in authority to any instrument created by the Ministry of Magic, because they had been created before the Ministry of Magic existed. Harry picked up the black ring. It fit. The torches in the chamber shifted the instant it seated on his finger, the green-tinged light tilting into something that carried no color name he had, but that occupied the space where obsidian black would appear, if light were capable of being obsidian black. Not dark, not dimmer, simply different. The Le Fay frequency, registering in the physical world for the first time in decades. Hermione put on her ring without ceremony or hesitation. Her light met his. The chamber settled into a balance that required both to exist. Under the Charter of Avalon, Provision 14, Ragnarok said, Le Fay heirs upon claim of succession are emancipated under their own magical authority. You are no longer wards of the ministry. You are no longer subject to the trace. You are no longer under the legal jurisdiction of any guardian arrangement currently in effect. He placed the charter itself on the table, ancient parchment that glowed the instant both signets' light touched it, the obsidian seal in its corner catching both frequencies at once. The bank extends its formal recognition, Ragnarok said. Long overdue. Hagrid was still in the doorway of the original chamber when Harry found him on the way out. He looked like a man who had arrived to collect a package and discovered the package was a geological feature. Dumbledore's not going to like this, he said, in the voice of someone stating a fact that gave him complicated feelings. Hermione, passing him with the certified copy of the charter already tucked under her arm and a notebook open in her other hand, said, Good. Outside on the Gringotts steps, Harry conjured a small sphere of light above his palm, not with a wand, with intention alone, the way the signet's resonance suggested was possible. It appeared. Obsidian black, luminous, real from somewhere in the ministry, a trace monitoring owl lifted from its perch, carrying a warning letter addressed to the child's legal guardian. It flew 3 blocks, landed on a Diagon Alley post, and sat there. The letter in its pouch glowed briefly obsidian. Then the parchment went blank. The Underage Detection System Cross referenced the event against the Charter of Avalon exemption clause that had been sitting in its inactive record since 1707, and quietly reclassified the detection as exempt. The owl flew away. No letter. No warning. No leverage. Harry closed his hand around the obsidian light and let it go. Caer Morgana presented itself as a hill until it didn't. The path appeared on the 3rd morning of their approach, not gradually, but between one step and the next, the way a word appeared in your peripheral vision when you finally understood the language. Harry's void signet had warmed approximately 6 seconds before he saw it, and he had stopped walking on the basis of the warmth alone, which was the first indication that the ring was teaching him things he hadn't explicitly studied. The estate was a fortress library. Ragnarok had used the compound noun, and standing before it, Harry understood the precision of it. It was not a castle that contained books. It was a place where the act of knowing and the act of being defended against the world were so thoroughly intertwined that the architecture had stopped distinguishing between them. The doors opened before they touched them. Inside, warmth, not the performed warmth of a recently lit fire, but the deep stone warmth of a building that had been holding heat since before living memory. The specific temperature of something that had never been allowed to go cold. The unseen were already there. Harry saw them as motion at the edge of attention, something adjusting a curtain, something carrying a tray, something that existed in the precisely calibrated peripheral space between visible and not. They did not speak. They did not need to be instructed. By the time he had walked from the entrance to the main hall, his bag had been taken to what turned out to be his room, a meal had appeared on the central table, and the fire in the hall's hearth had adjusted from welcoming warmth to working warmth, the difference being approximately 4 degrees and the quality of light it cast on a reading surface. Hermione stood in the entrance to the library corridor and did not move for a long time. "How many rooms?" she said eventually. "I haven't counted," Harry said. "I'm going to count," she said, in the tone of someone stating an administrative intention, and walked in. The memory archive was a chamber at the library's deepest point. It did not look the way Harry had imagined. He had expected something dramatic, something that announced its significance through scale or decoration. What he found was a room of moderate size, with shelves of small, dark objects arranged with the obsessive precision of a very particular mind. Hermione picked up one of them, and her eyes went to the specific, unfocused quality of someone seeing something that wasn't in the room. He sat and waited. After 4 minutes, she came back. She set the object down with careful hands, a memory of ward construction. From approximately 600 years ago. Not a recording, an experience. I could feel the intention architecture the way she felt it when she built it, not the way she described it afterward. There's no gap between the knowledge and the knowing. He looked at the rows of objects, hundreds of them, each containing the lived magical experience of someone who had worked in this place across centuries. The accumulated knowledge of a tradition that the wizarding world above had spent 1,000 years pretending did not exist. The training began that afternoon. Not formally, no instructor, no curriculum document. What Harry needed first was to understand what Lefay sorcery actually was before he could be expected to do anything useful with it. What it was? Intention without mediation. Standard magic operated through the wand. The wand focused the intention, crystallized it, gave it precision. Lefay sorcery was not a better wand. It was a different understanding of fire. By the end of the first week, Harry could void walk through any material in the estate not specifically keyed to the LeFay resonance itself. By the end of the second week, he had begun working with the command voice, a register he was remembering rather than developing, the way you remembered a language spoken around you before you had words for it. Magical creatures responded to it before he understood what he was doing. Hermione's progress ran on its own track. By the end of the third week, she had developed soul sight to the point of practical application. She could read a person's soul signature through proximity, could feel the dissonance of a lie the way she felt a grammatical error. She had also produced a theoretical framework for ward architecture that incorporated principles the standard Hogwarts curriculum would not cover until 6th year. She showed him the framework on a Thursday evening. He read it. He understood it. Not the way he understood academic material, but the way he understood a door, from the inside. The section on intention absorption needs one addition, he said, and wrote 4 sentences in her margin. Hermione read the 4 sentences and wrote 8 beneath them, extending the implication into a full sub-theory of curse reversal applications. This was how it worked. Not collaboration as agreement, collaboration as complementary capacity. He saw the shape of things, she read the content within the shape. Together, the archive that would take 3 years alone would take something considerably less. On the last day of August, Hermione said, "Without looking up, Hogwarts opens tomorrow. We should decide what we want from the school before we arrive," Harry said, rather than arriving and deciding in response to what the school wants from us. Resources, the library, the institutional access, the people. She closed the notebook. We should remember that Hogwarts was built by 4 people who thought they were more important than the people they were teaching. We are not going to make the same error. The Hogwarts Express left at 11. They were on the platform at 10:40, watching the platform fill with the organized chaos of families who had done this before and families that hadn't, and were compensating for inexperience with volume. The midnight silk of their robes did not catch light the way fabric was supposed to catch it. It had depth, a quality of shadow that existed independently of the ambient lighting. The crow crest on Harry's chest was worked in a silver that was not embroidery, but something closer to the way frost formed on a surface. Hermione's moon crest sat above her left shoulder, the crescent rendered in the same technique. A boy with very blonde hair saw them from halfway down the platform and went still. Harry noted him through the soul sight that had become reflexive after a month of practice, the boy's soul signature sharp and practiced. The quality of someone who had learned to perform composure at an age when other children were still learning to perform effort. Underneath the performance, recognition, and underneath the recognition, the specific cold weight of information he hadn't wanted to receive. Draco Malfoy had been briefed. Harry filed this as expected and moved on. They found a compartment without difficulty. A boy with red hair put his head in around Redding, said bloody hell with honest descriptive emphasis at the sight of the robes, and was gestured into the seat across from them. Ron Weasley had the particular body language of someone comfortable in their own skin, and slightly too aware of it in other people's presence. Not arrogance, but its inverse. His soul signature was open without performance, the specific quality of someone who had not yet learned that visibility was a vulnerability. Harry found it, in a functional sense, restful, the crow crest, Ron said. My mum knows what that means. She went very quiet when she read your name on the Hogwarts list. Harry Potter, Harry said. Hermione Granger, the Harry Potter. There's documentation, Hermione said, that suggests the definite article is doing quite a lot of work in that sentence. But yes. Ron absorbed this. His soul signature registered not starstruck quality, but genuine curiosity. The interest of someone who found unexpected things interesting rather than threatening. The train moved north. He produced a chess set, and Harry played him for the last 2 hours of the journey, and Ron was the best player Harry had encountered. Which was interesting, because Harry's void walking had given him a spatial perception that translated surprisingly well to board strategy, and he still found himself 3 moves behind at every critical juncture. watching Ron's pieces move with the settled authority of a player who was not so much calculating as remembering. "You're very good," Harry said, after the second game. "Yeah," Ron said, without self-consciousness. "It's the one thing!" Harry looked at him. Soul Sight confirmed what the words suggested. Someone who had organized their self-image around a single competence, because the other competences had been preoccupied by louder, more confident people. He filed this as well. The social architecture of Hogwarts took approximately 4 days to establish itself around them. Not through any deliberate campaign on Harry and Hermione's part, they did not issue proclamations, seek alliances, or perform the careful social navigation that first years generally engaged in during the initial week. The architecture established itself the way architecture always established itself around Le Fay resonance, by responding to what was actually present rather than to what was being performed. What was present, in practical terms, was 2 11-year-olds who had spent August in a fortress library studying 12 centuries of magical theory, and who were now sitting in classrooms covering material they had completed in the first week of their training. They were not bored exactly. The classrooms offered the specific value of watching how people thought about magic when they were learning it, without access to its foundations, which was itself a form of information. But there was no concealing the gap between what was being taught and what they knew, and gaps of that magnitude were visible without anyone trying to see them. Professor Flitwick's Charms class in the second week, every first year, spent 20 minutes attempting to make a feather levitate. Harry watched the process with the attention he brought to all things, and then, when Flitwick reached his end of the table, produced the charm correctly on the first attempt, and then, out of genuine curiosity about the mechanism rather than any desire to demonstrate, wordlessly adjusted the charm's architecture mid-execution to hold the feather at a fixed height regardless of air currents. Flitwick blinked at the feather, at Harry, at the feather again. "Could you?" he began. "It's anchored to a spatial coordinate rather than a relative height," Hermione said, from the next seat. "The standard charm is relative to the wand position, which is why it destabilizes with movement. If you encode the target height as an absolute coordinate at casting, it persists. We can write up the theoretical basis if you'd like." Flitwick wrote something in his gradebook that took an unusual amount of time for a simple mark. The pattern established itself without drama. By the end of week 2, the following was socially understood throughout Gryffindor and approximately half of Hufflepuff. Whatever hierarchy had been forming in the first days of term, it had a ceiling, and the ceiling was occupied. The remarkable thing about the social response to Harry and Hermione was that resentment was largely absent. Resentment required proximity to aspiration, and what they represented was so categorically different from the standard Hogwarts ambition structure that competing with it felt like the wrong game entirely. The Slytherin response was more complicated. Draco Malfoy had established his ground in the first week with the practiced efficiency of someone following a briefed plan, the careful wide berth, the neutral expression, the posture of someone who had been told specifically not to make the mistake of engaging. His followers followed his lead with varying degrees of comprehension about why. Lucius Malfoy arrived on a Tuesday in November in his winter robes, charcoal and silver, communicating expense through restraint rather than display, the sophistication that distinguished old money from new. He moved through the entrance hall with the ease of a man accustomed to institutional spaces reconfiguring themselves around his authority. "Harry Potter," he said, intercepting them between morning lessons. "Your guardian will want to know you're making unusual claims." The word guardian carried its full payload: the Dursleys, the Ministry, Dumbledore, every adult with legal standing over Harry's life who could be arranged into leverage. Harry looked at Lucius Malfoy's soul signature, the specific quality of someone who had organized their entire self around institutional power and had therefore become, at the soul level, somewhat hollow in the places where self would otherwise have lived. Very capable, very practiced. Genuinely dangerous within a specific set of conditions, entirely unprepared for conditions that fell outside those parameters. "I don't have a guardian," Harry said. "I have legal standing. You might want to check the Gringotts register before you finish that sentence." Hermione had already opened her bag. She placed the certified copy of the Charter of Avalon on the nearest windowsill, ancient parchment, the weight and color of something that had existed for 11 centuries and was not interested in performing its own significance. It opened itself to the Emancipation Clause with the mild purposefulness of a document that knew which section was relevant. The obsidian seal in the corner caught the corridor's torchlight. Lucius Malfoy looked at the document. A specific color left his face. Not the dramatic pallor of shock, but the controlled draining of a man running a calculation and arriving, with each successive step, at a result he had not allocated space for. He recognized the charter. The recognition was itself information. He had studied it, or had someone study it for him, which meant he had known it was theoretically possible, and had made some arrangement in his mind to treat the theory as sufficiently improbable to be safely dismissed. The arrangement had been wrong. "Good afternoon, Mr. Malfoy," Hermione said. She picked up the charter and returned it to her bag. "We mustn't be late for Transfiguration." They walked past him. He did not move to stop them. The boats crossed the Black Lake in the September dark, and Hogwarts came into view in the way it always did for people encountering it for the first time. Enormous, lit. Designed by people who understood that a first visual impression was also an argument about what a place was for. Harry felt the Lefay resonance stir as they approached, older than the Heirs of Morgana practice ground, layered, the specific quality of a structure built by people operating adjacent to Lefay principles without having full access to them. The castle knew them. He felt this before they crossed the threshold, the void signet's warmth shifting from its standard ambient register to something more specific, more directed. The way a compass found its orientation when you stopped moving. Hermione touched his arm once without looking at him. She felt it too. The sorting hat, placed on its stool, sat for longer than anyone in the room had been anticipating. A silence it had not produced in 100 years of ceremonies. Then it spoke. "The castle remembers you. Welcome home, masters." A pause that lasted the specific length of time required for 200 students, 7 faculty members, and a collection of ghosts to understand that what they had just heard was not the standard formula. Then, with the slight air of something returning to an administrative requirement from a more significant proceeding, but for the purposes of administration, Gryffindor, Harry sat. The sorting continued. Hermione's was identical in essential quality and briefer in duration. The hat touched her hair and said, without the opening pause, "Welcome home." Gryffindor, she sat beside Harry with the expression of someone who has confirmed a hypothesis they were 60% certain about and revised their certainty upward. Harry walked through the great hall doors and every enchanted candle flared obsidian for exactly 1 second. Not dark, black burning, the Lefay frequency expressing itself in the only visual register available to a flame encountering 2 Lefay heirs for the first time. The students looked up. The ghosts went still. At the high table, 3 professors made small involuntary movements. A turbaned figure went absolutely rigid. Harry's soul sight was active in its reflexive way, and he read the room in the second between entering and taking his first full step. Most faculty soul signatures were complicated in the interesting ways that people who had spent careers in education were complicated, layered with purpose and compromise, and the specific sediment of caring about something institutional for a long time. McGonagall, granite and genuine. Dumbledore at the table's center, very still, his soul signature vast and old, containing within it a quality of awareness that was already assessing Harry right back. And Quirrell. The doubled soul signature was immediately and unmistakably visible, 2 presences occupying 1 body. Quirrell's own soul signature was underneath, thin, frightened, pulled out of shape by months of occupation. Over it, through it, around it, Voldemort's fragment, dark and precise and ancient in the way that very old malice was ancient, having stripped itself of everything that wasn't essential. At the feast, when Quirrell made his way along the edge of the hall with an extended hand and a friendly, nervous introduction, Harry kept his hands in his lap. "Professor Quirrell," he said, in the even tone of someone making a factual observation. "How is your turban?" The friendly, nervous performance stopped. Something moved under the fabric, a recoil happening in the wrong direction to belong to Quirrell's own nervous system. The extended hand withdrew. Quirrell's mouth opened, produced no words, and closed again. "Excuse me," he said. He made his way back toward the staff table without completing his circuit of the room. Across the table, Hermione had already turned to the first page of a new notebook. She wrote one sentence in her careful, rapid hand. "Quirrell, inhabited. Do not touch." "Leverage," she underlined the final word. The candles burned warm and gold above the 4 house tables. The enchanted ceiling held its September stars, and in the corner of Hermione's notebook, the word leverage sat with the patient weight of something that was not a threat and not a plan, but was the raw material from which both could be made when the time came. In the first days of term, Harry's void-walking perception had already mapped the castle's significant magical objects. The Philosopher's Stone had been transferred to Hogwarts before the school year began. Ragnarok's documentation had referenced it, and Harry felt its presence in his first exploration of the 3rd-floor corridor the week after sorting. Sitting behind a locked door, his void-walking identified immediately as significant. He spent an hour simply feeling its resonance from a distance, not powerful in the aggressive way that dangerous things were powerful, but dense, concentrated, carrying within it the specific quality of something that contained more than its physical form should logically hold. The warmth of it was almost identical to the warmth of the void signet, which was interesting and filed for later. "The stone was here before we arrived," he told Hermione that evening. "Obviously," she said. Ragnarok confirmed it was moved from Vault 713 in July. The protections on the 3rd floor are designed well, but not from Lefay principles. They can be bypassed. Should we want to bypass them? "We may not need to bypass them," Harry said. "We need to know whether Quirrell will try." At the end of the table, Neville Longbottom knocked over his goblet at the feast and apologized to it before catching himself. Harry had spent 20 minutes with him after Transfiguration in the 3rd week, not encouraging him exactly, but showing him what his magic was doing and where it was blocked and how to clear it. Neville listened with an attention that changed the quality of his expression, which was the specific change that happened when someone who had been told repeatedly that something was wrong with them encountered instead a description of what was actually happening and found it was addressable. By the end of October, the goblets he knocked over were his own rather than other people's, which was progress. On a Thursday of the 2nd week, walking between Charms and Transfiguration, Harry heard from the corridor junction ahead the specific quality of magical sound that the Lefay resonance had taught him to distinguish from ordinary ambient noise, not the background static of dozens of wands being carried through a building, but something directional. Targeted, he went around the corner. A Slytherin 3rd year had his wand aimed at a 2nd year Hufflepuff boy backed against the wall with his books held against his chest and the involuntary protective gesture of someone who had done this before and knew the sequence. Harry stopped. He did not reach for his wand. He said, in the quiet register of the command voice, "No." The spell did not fire. Not a deflection. Harry had not cast anything. The spell simply did not leave the 3rd year's wand. The intention arrived at the output point and found that the architecture between intention and execution had developed, in the past 3 seconds, a specific incompatibility with the impulse being directed at someone in Harry's immediate vicinity. "Walk away," Harry said. The 3rd year walked away. He tracked Quirrell's deterioration through soul sight across the months. In September, the doubled quality was alarming, but stable. By October, the host's own signature had begun to lose definition at its edges. Not absorption, but consumption. The way ink lost distinctness when the paper beneath it was wet. The fragment was not taking over so much as the host was being used up. "How long?" Hermione said, when he described this on a Sunday evening in November. "At the current rate, he'll be largely gone by spring. The fragment won't have a functional host after that. It will either need to find another one, or find what it came for." They looked at each other across the library table. They did the retrieval on a Wednesday evening, sitting across from each other in the library, with their hands touching lightly. Not for warmth, but because the resonance between the two signets was amplified by physical proximity, and what they were attempting was an extrapolation from first principles that neither had done before, and both were certain was possible. Harry extended the void walking not as movement, but as perception. The reaching outward that Care Morgane had taught him in the first week. He felt the castle around him, the stone, the corridors, the hundreds of soul signatures in various states of sleep or wakefulness, the enchantments layered through the walls like old music. And further, deeper, past the locked door and through the sequence of obstacles, the devil's snare's slow vegetative awareness, the mechanical precision of the enchanted keys, the chess pieces with their simplified but genuine tactical intelligence. And then the stone. He reached for it not by grasping but by recognizing, the way you recognize someone by their voice before seeing their face, and recognition in the void was the same as presence. The Philosopher's Stone appeared on the library table between them. It arrived without sound, without light, without any theatrical signatures of a significant magical act. Simply not there and then there, a red stone approximately the size of a large walnut, sitting on the wooden table between two 11-year-olds, warm in a way that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "That worked," Hermione said, in the tone of someone confirming an experimental result. She produced a cloth and wrapped the stone carefully. "We should write to Dumbledore." The letter took 3 drafts. The third was the right length and the right tone, formal without being cold, specific without being exhaustive. "Dear Professor Dumbledore, we have removed the Philosopher's Stone from its vault before it could be accessed by the presence currently occupying Professor Quirrell. We have enclosed the relevant documentation regarding the security concern. We would welcome a conversation about Professor Quirrell's situation at your earliest convenience, as the host will require attention before the term ends. Regards, H.J. Potter, H.J. Granger, enclosed with the stone, a certified copy of the Charter of Avalon with the relevant security authority clauses highlighted. Dumbledore's responding note arrived 3 days later and contained a quality of considered restraint that Harry was learning to read as Dumbledore's response to being surprised. "Thank you. I will handle the matter of our colleague with the appropriate care. I would, however, ask that we speak at your convenience." Naturally was doing interesting work in that sentence. By mid-December, Madame Pomfrey found Quirrell in his office. She described it in her report as severe magical depletion of unknown origin, which was accurate as far as it went. The fragment, denied the stone and weakened by Harry and Hermione's sustained proximity throughout the term, had spent itself further than its host could sustain. Quirrell was taken to St. Mungo's on December 19th. He would spend 4 months there. He would recover approximately 70% of himself. At the end of term feast, Dumbledore raised his glass. Not to the table generally, but specifically, in Harry and Hermione's direction. A small, precise gesture lasting perhaps 2 seconds, communicating in the compressed language of a very old man who had been in many rooms with many kinds of power. "I see you. I understand what you are. I am not your enemy. I am updating my approach." Harry returned the gesture with a slight inclination of his head. "He's going to be manageable," Harry said. "He's going to be interesting," Hermione corrected. "Which is better?" Hermione saw the diary on a Tuesday in September. Not literally saw, she was 4 tables away in the Gryffindor common room when her soul sight registered an anomaly in the ambient soul signature landscape of the room. She had become accustomed to the common room's particular emotional texture, the specific mixture of tiredness and low-level anxiety and occasional genuine contentment that characterized 40 people living and working in the same space through the rhythms of an academic term. She knew this texture the way you knew the temperature of a familiar room, not by measuring it but by noticing when it was wrong. The wrong thing was at Ginny Weasley's table. Small, cold, intentional, in a way that was categorically different from the living soul signatures around it, the specific quality of something designed to seem alive rather than something that was. Dark in the register that the LaFay soul site read as dark, not the ordinary darkness of someone having a difficult evening, but the constructed darkness of something whose purpose was harm, directed specifically at the person currently holding it. "Ginny," Hermione said, crossing the room. "That notebook. May I see it?" Ginny had the expression of someone who had been thinking about something private and had been interrupted mid-thought. "It's just a diary," she said. "I know, I'm curious about it. I collect interesting stationery." This was not true. Ginny, who was 11 and not yet practiced at reading the precise quality of an adult's dishonesty, handed it over. The moment Hermione's hand closed around it, the Horcrux's consciousness reached for her. A pressure at the edge of her soul signature. The specific sensation of something that had been waiting for contact and was now extending toward her with the methodical precision of a predator that had learned patience. She spent 3 seconds establishing that her soul signature was completely, structurally impervious to the approach. Then she closed the diary and looked at it with soul sight fully extended into the object itself. What she found, a fragment of a human soul, stripped of context, stripped of most of its original complexity, reduced to its most essential element, the will to survive at any cost and the specific intelligence required to pursue survival through the corruption of whatever was available. A fragment of Voldemort's soul, constructed to anchor his existence against death. She extracted Riddle's influence from Ginny the following day. 15 minutes in the common room, Ginny's hand in hers under the pretense of reading together, soul sight extended to the specific point of contact between Ginny's soul and the Riddle impression accumulating at its edge. She showed Ginny's own soul signature the difference between her own thoughts and the ones arriving from outside. Ginny blinked, said she had a headache. The next morning she looked entirely herself. That evening, Harry looked at the diary with soul sight and said, "How many of these do you think he made?" The archive has documentation on soul splitting. He would have aimed for a number of symbolic significance. She had already been considering this. 6 deliberate anchors is my estimate. One has the specific quality of a creation from his school years, this diary, and the architecture of the others would follow the pattern of subsequent significant deaths and objects of power. A pause. "I also checked your soul signature directly. The LaFay resonance in your blood appears to have repelled the anchoring in 1981, the night Voldemort cast the killing curse at you. A fragment attempted to attach to the nearest living magical consciousness. The LaFay frequency was incompatible with it. The fragment was deflected, not embedded. You are entirely your own." Harry considered this. "That's useful to know." "Yes," Hermione said, with the expression she wore when a working model had been confirmed. "So, 5 to find, now that we have the diary." He made 6 total. "We've destroyed 1. 5 to find," Harry agreed. They opened the chamber on a Saturday afternoon in October. Harry spoke to the sink in the second-floor girls' bathroom and the command voice register, the same frequency that operated with serpentine magical creatures, the frequency his blood carried as naturally as breath. The sink moved. The pipe opened. They descended. The chamber was extraordinary in the way that things built by people operating adjacent to enormous power without full access to it were extraordinary, reaching towards something the builder could feel but not quite grasp. The serpent pillars. The shallow water. The stone face of Salazar Slytherin at the far end, looking down with the expression of someone who had built a room to wait for someone and had the patience of stone. Hermione walked with her notebook open, writing without looking at the page. Pre-Hogwarts construction on the lower sections. The foundation layer is at least 4 centuries older than the school. He built around something that was already here. Yes, Harry said. He had felt this from the entrance. It was hers before it was his. He stood at the center of the chamber and spoke, not in the command voice's directing register, but in the register that acknowledged. The frequency that said, "I know what you are, and I know what I am, and I am asking you, not ordering you, to hear me." The water around their feet went still. Then the far darkness began to move. It moved slowly, which was appropriate for something 60 feet long that had been occupying the same chamber for over 1,000 years and was in no hurry. The sound of its approach was the sound of enormous scales over wet stone, carrying its own weight. The basilisk emerged from the wall beside Slytherin's stone face with its eyes closed, and stopped 15 feet away, its head lowered until it was level with them. Not a strike position. A listening position. "You carry the crow," it said. "Yes," Harry said. "The moon is with you." "Yes." A pause that lasted the specific length of time required for something 1,000 years old to assess something it had been waiting 1,000 years to assess. The boy who put his soul in parchment. "He is gone from this place?" Harry held up the diary. The basilisk's exhale was a sound the chamber seemed to hold rather than echo. The sound of something being released from a very long obligation. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing you don't choose to give," Harry said. "The chamber is yours. You were here before the school. I'd like you to be part of what the castle protects rather than what it contains, if you're willing. But the choice belongs to you." The basilisk was still for a long time. Then it made a sound, harmonically complex, layered, the specific sound of something that had existed in silence for a millennium and had found, unexpectedly, a register worth using. "I will remain," it said. "I will answer the crow when called. And the moon. I will not open my eyes in your presence without permission." "Thank you," Harry said. He placed the diary on the chamber floor and moved back. The basilisk lowered its enormous head toward the diary, opened its mouth, and struck, the venom arriving in the specific, deliberate way that something capable of total destruction applied that capability to a precise target. Where basilisk venom touched the diary's pages, the constructed darkness that had been Riddle's Horcrux writhed against its container and lost. The soul fragment ceased in the way that things ceased when the mechanism sustaining them was dissolved at the fundamental level. The venom cared nothing for the distinction between a living mind and a manufactured approximation of one. It simply unmade what was unmaking able. The diary was paper. Old, well-made, blank. Hermione picked it up, examined it, made a note. 5 to find, she said. 5 to find, Harry agreed. Above them, through the chamber's stone ceiling and the castle's foundation layers and the corridors and the classrooms and the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall, Hogwarts breathed in the specific way it breathed, when something that had been wrong in its depths for 1,000 years had just, finally, been corrected. The oath activated in Azkaban on the morning of August 2nd, 1991. Sirius Black had been in Cell 14 for 9 years and 10 months, which was long enough to have lost count of the days 3 separate times, and to have developed, as a coping mechanism, the specific discipline of not losing count again. He knew the date because he counted, and because counting was one of the last things that was entirely his. The Dementors took joy, took warmth, took the texture of good memories, but they could not take arithmetic. The activation did not feel like anything he had language for. It was closer to the sensation of a compass finding north, but inside, rather than in his hand, something that had been disoriented for 9 years and 10 months, and had just, in a single moment, oriented. He knew what it meant, because it was in his blood, and the things in your blood were the things you knew before you knew anything. The succession had activated. The heirs had claimed their inheritance. The oath the House of Black had been carrying for 11 centuries had registered, and was now something more than a family tradition he had only half believed in. He sat back against the cell wall and breathed. He was not going to escape today. Escaping today would be imprecise, and imprecision at this stage would compromise everything that came after. He was going to wait and prepare, and when the moment was exactly right, he was going to be the person the oath needed him to be. He escaped in the first week of July 1993, using the animagus form that the Dementors could not affect, moving through the prison's margins in the body of a large black dog, following the Lefay resonance north and east toward a hill that looked like a hill until it didn't. The gate of Heirs Morgana opened before he reached it. He stood in the entrance to the main hall and looked at the fire in the hearth and looked at the two young people sitting at the table, one of them reading and one of them looking at the door with the specific quality of someone who had felt him coming and was unsurprised. He looked terrible. He knew this without needing to see himself, gaunt, hollow-eyed, carrying the particular quality of someone who had maintained their mind through 9 years of Dementor proximity through sheer force of structure, and was now, in the presence of genuine warmth for the first time in almost a decade, finding that the structure had been doing most of the work and the person inside it was somewhat less steady than the structure had implied. He sat down because his legs made the decision before he did. "We know about Peter," Harry said. Sirius closed his eyes. The specific relief of a thing that had been true for 9 years being said aloud by someone who already knew it, no performance required, no convincing, no explaining, was a different kind of warmth than the Dementors could take. It was the warmth of being believed by someone who had no reason to doubt in the first place. When he opened his eyes, Hermione was already producing a notebook. She placed it on the table between them and said, simply, "From the beginning. Take your time." They talked for 2 days. Sirius told them about James and Lily, about the easy arrogance of their early friendship, the way the war had compressed that arrogance into something harder and more useful, the specific quality of James Potter at 20 as someone who had learned the difference between performance and substance, and had chosen substance in every moment that mattered. He spoke about the Fidelius charm, about his suggestion to switch secret keepers at the last moment, the decision that had seemed clever and had been catastrophic, when the cleverness was applied to a situation that required trust rather than strategy. He told them about Peter, about the years of small signs he had dismissed, because dismissing them was easier than the alternative, the way Peter's laughter was always half a beat off, the way he angled himself toward power in the specific style of someone who had no center of their own and needed to orbit something else. He told them about the street in Muggle London and what he had found there and what he had done, and then what Peter had done, and then the explosion and the finger and the drain. Hermione listened with the quality of attention she gave to information that was going to be used, not just stored. She asked 4 questions, all of them directed at the exact points where the testimony would need to be airtight under legal scrutiny. Sirius answered all 4 without needing to be prompted to precision, which she noted as the specific quality of testimony from someone who had been recounting the same night in his own mind for 9 years and 10 months, and had therefore refined it to its most accurate form through sheer repetition. By the end of the 2nd day, she had the outline of a legal case. Crookshanks had been watching Sirius from the hearthrug with the sustained focus of a cat who had identified something significant and was waiting for confirmation. On the morning of the 3rd day, he crossed the room and sat on Sirius's foot. "Ron Weasley's rat," Hermione said, answering the look on Sirius's face before it had fully formed. 12 years old, missing a toe on his right front paw. "I have been monitoring his soul signature since November of last year. It has the doubled quality of an animagus in sustained transformation. I knew he was a human being in rat form. I knew it was Peter Pettigrew since hearing your account." Sirius looked at her for a moment. "You could have moved sooner." "We waited," Harry said, "because the case needed to be complete before we moved. A half-complete case gives him time to run. A complete case doesn't. What does a complete case look like?" 200 witnesses, Hermione said. Ministry representatives present. Pettigrew's transformation on record in front of people who cannot be obliviated collectively without the Ministry acknowledging a conspiracy larger than any cover-up they'd be willing to attempt. The Great Hall, Harry said. The Saturday lunch period in October had the specific population density that Hermione had determined, after 3 weeks of observational data, was optimal. Near full student attendance, 4 faculty members including McGonagall, and 2 visiting representatives from the Ministry who had arrived that morning for an educational standards review and had not yet had their formal meeting with Dumbledore. Harry stood at the Gryffindor table. He did not raise his voice. The castle's enchanted ceiling, responsive to the LeFay frequency in the way it had been responsive since September 1st of their first year, amplified his words without being asked. "Scabbers," he said. "Come." Ron's rat left Ron's pocket before Ron understood what was happening. It ran the length of the table in the specific frantic way of something that had maintained its survival through a decade of excellent camouflage, and had just found the camouflage was not functioning. It arrived in front of Harry, and stopped. Harry looked at it. "Peter," he said. "Change back." Peter Pettigrew transformed in front of 200 students, 7 faculty members, and 2 ministry representatives. He was short and balding and missing a finger on his right hand, and he stood on the Gryffindor table for approximately 3 seconds, with the expression of someone who had survived through strategic invisibility for 13 years, and had just, irrevocably, become visible. One of the ministry representatives had his wand out before Pettigrew completed the transformation. "Ministry of Magic. You are detained." Pettigrew did not attempt to run. There was nowhere to run to. Sirius Black's trial was expedited. The testimony was not from a single witness in a tunnel at midnight. It was from 200 people in a dining hall at noon. From 2 ministry representatives present at the transformation, and from Harry Potter and Hermione Granger who produced, through Gringotts' legal representation, the truth binding that made false testimony structurally impossible in the Wizengamot chamber. The vote was 23-3. Sirius Black, exonerated, walked out of the Wizengamot chamber into the ministry atrium on a Thursday afternoon, and found Harry and Hermione waiting on a bench near the fountain. He looked at them, at the fountain, at the atrium ceiling, which was enchanted to show a different kind of sky than Hogwarts' ceiling. The official, approved sky of institutional wizarding Britain. Less honest than the one that showed actual weather. "You don't need a guardian," he said. "You're emancipated. You knew that when you asked." "Yes," Harry said. "Then why? I'd like someone in my corner that I chose," Harry said. "That's different from needing one." Sirius stood in the ministry atrium and looked at a 13-year-old who had arranged his exoneration with the methodical precision of someone doing something they had planned carefully and were executing without self-congratulation. He put his hand on Harry's shoulder, awkwardly because he was still learning to be a person who did that. Because 9 years and 10 months in Azkaban had stripped away the easy physicality of it, and he was rebuilding from first principles. Harry did not move away. Hermione, 2 feet away, was reading the Wizengamot's summary minutes with the focused attention of someone looking for procedural errors. She had found 2 already and was composing a correction request in the margin. She was giving them the moment. It was the kindest thing she could have done, and she was doing it by pretending not to be doing it, which was the kind of kindness worth more than its visible counterpart. Sirius stood in the atrium with his hand on Harry's shoulder and let himself feel, for the first time in 13 years, that the thing he had been existing toward was simply here. The blood tithe document was 37 pages long. Hermione had written it in 2 weeks, 7 tabbed sections, the Goblin legal team's certification mark on the cover page, and a financial quantification that went back 3 generations. 2 generations of active suppression of LeFay succession records. 1 generation of direct financial benefit from the political structures the suppression had enabled. The methodology was conservative, approximately 40% of the full calculable claim, discounting anything where causation couldn't be established to the standard the goblin legal framework required. "We could file the full claim," she noted. "The conservative version is more defensible and produces more durable results," Harry said. "If it's challenged, we want the calculation to hold." "Yes, that's why I discounted it." The tithe was filed the following morning. Lucius Malfoy's Gringotts account was assessed at 9 in the morning on a Thursday. The calculation ran for 40 minutes. At 9:40, the Malfoy liquid assets at Gringotts were reduced by 40% before the document had been in Lucius's hands long enough for him to finish reading it. Draco Malfoy, at Hogwarts, received his October pocket money 3 weeks late and in reduced amount. He did not know why. He wrote to his father. The response, when it came, was unusually short. The goblet of fire was installed in the entrance hall on the last day of October, burning blue-white with the specific quality of something that had been making the same assessment for 6 centuries and had developed very precise opinions about what it was looking for. Its one thought was, find the worthy. Hermione had been monitoring all magical objects in the tournament perimeter since Beauxbatons arrived. She documented 23 significant magical objects in the first week. 22 were exactly what they appeared to be. The 23rd was a trophy cup in the maze preparation area with a secondary enchantment structure underneath its primary one, not sophisticated enough to escape her ward architecture analysis. Portkey, she told Harry on the evening of the 30th, keyed to a location that doesn't appear in any ministry travel registry. The sole signature on the destination anchor has a dark mark association. Someone put a portkey in the tournament trophy. Someone put a portkey in the tournament trophy leading to a location connected to Voldemort's network, she said. And someone entered your name in the goblet. The entry was filed last night, between 11 and midnight. The goblet registered it. I could feel the sole signature mismatch from the dormitory. Harry had felt it too. A quality of wrongness in the goblet's burning that had woken him at 11:30. The tournament's magic registering an entry that didn't match its own selection criteria. "The portkey first," Harry said. "Neutralize the destination before anyone can reach it." Hermione had already designed the neutralization. She walked him through it in 6 minutes. A targeted curse reversal applied not to the portkey's transportation function, but to its destination anchor, unmaking the connection between the cup and wherever it was keyed to without disturbing the cup's physical form. She performed it at 2 in the morning, her hand flat on the wall of the maze preparation area. The curse reversal extending through stone and distance to the specific magical structure she had been mapping for 11 days. The connection severed cleanly. "Done," she said. Their formal entry to the tournament was submitted through Gringotts' legal representation on the basis of the Charter's provision that Lefay heirs had formal right to participate in any proceeding of wizarding significance as named parties. The ICW's response arrived in 48 hours and occupied a register somewhere between institutional alarm and legal helplessness. The Charter predated the tournament's own founding documents by 8 centuries. Harry Potter and Hermione Granger were registered as the 5th entry, competing under the designation of the House of Lefay. Victor Krum, when he heard about this, said something in Bulgarian to his Durmstrang companions that translated, roughly, as, "The board has just changed." The Dragon Task. Harry walked to the edge of the Hungarian Horntail's enclosure and stopped. He did not reach for his wand. He extended the command voice in the register he used for non-serpentine magical creatures, not language, not instruction, but the resonance frequency that said, "I know what you are. I am not what you're afraid of." The Horntail turned its head. Its posture changed, the coiled readiness of a creature anticipating a threat relaxing into the wariness of a creature that had reclassified the thing in front of it. Still watching. Not attacking. Harry walked to the golden egg while the Horntail watched him with the flat, ancient attention of something that had decided to observe rather than engage. The crowd in the stands had been silent since approximately 60 seconds into his approach. The score was the highest of the task. For Hermione, the lake task required 11 minutes. The ward architecture she used inverted the relationship between surface and depth in a column approximately 2 meters in diameter. She walked into the lake by walking down through air. She retrieved Crookshanks in 9 minutes. The remaining 2 minutes were spent taking acoustic measurements of the Merpeople settlement's architecture, because she had 2 minutes and acoustic measurements were useful. "You did this during the task," Harry said that evening. "I had 2 minutes before I needed to surface." Time management. The maze took 23 minutes. Hermione's ward architecture analysis of its structure, conducted through the perimeter wall over 2 weeks, had produced a complete topological map. They reached the trophy, a plain cup that was, now, simply a trophy. Cedric Diggory reached it in 41 minutes. When he raised it above his head, the crowd celebrated with the specific warmth of people watching someone who had worked genuinely hard win something genuinely fairly. Harry watched him from the maze exit. "He's good," Harry said. "He's excellent," Hermione said. His dragon approach in Task 1 was the best traditional technique in the competition. Then she walked toward the judges' area with the specific quality of someone approaching a conversation they had been looking forward to for 11 months. Rita Skeeter saw her coming. The expression on Rita Skeeter's face was the expression of a woman whose professional instincts were telling her several things simultaneously, and whose professional instincts were, unusually for her, entirely correct in every particular. "Miss Skeeter," Hermione said. "We filed the attached documentation with the Ministry's Animagus Registration Office last week." She held out a small envelope. Inside, a formal registration of one Rita Skeeter, Beetle Animagus, formerly unregistered. Completed in Hermione's handwriting. Dated, witnessed, certified. "We filled it in on your behalf. You're welcome." Rita Skeeter's coverage of the tournament's concluding ceremony was accurate in every factual particular and notably free of speculation, fabrication, and selective emphasis. It was the best piece she had written in a decade. Accuracy, it turned out, suited her. Voldemort returned in June, though not in the way Harry had been expecting. Pettigrew, denied Harry's blood and aware the primary plan had collapsed, executed a secondary ceremony in the grounds of a farmhouse in rural France in the 3rd week of June. He used blood from a captured Death Eater in lieu of Harry's, considerably less potent but sufficient for the restoration of a form. The ritual's other components were available. The restoration occurred. Harry felt it through the void signet at 3 a.m. as a quality of pressure change at the edge of the LeFay resonance network, the way you felt a door close in a building you were standing outside of. He was awake and at Hermione's door before the feeling had fully resolved. "France," she said, when she opened it. She had been awake for 6 minutes. "Rural, Southwest, he doesn't have my blood. No, the immunity is absent. She already had her notebook. He's weaker than he would have been. He's also mortal in a way he hasn't been for 50 years, because we've destroyed 5 of his 6 anchors, and he doesn't know we've found them all. He has 1 remaining. He'll come here rather than waiting for us to come to him. He needs a demonstration." "Hogwarts," Harry said. "Yes, the Death Eaters came on a Tuesday evening in late June, arriving at the outer ward boundary simultaneously from 4 compass points, approximately 30 signatures. The formation of a group that had drilled this approach and was executing it with the discipline of people who believed they were bringing sufficient force to overwhelm whatever was waiting. Harry and Hermione were already outside when they arrived. The ward architecture that Hermione had built around their position was not visible. It had not been designed to be visible. What she had built was something more fundamental, a space in which the intention structure of any incoming curse was absorbed at the moment of arrival rather than at the moment of contact. Curses directed at them did not arrive as curses, but as intentions that had been separated from their execution somewhere in the 12 feet between casting and landing. The Death Eater formation opened fire. Green light. Red light. Dark curses that Harry had spent 4 years identifying through soul sight and studying in the archive's records on historical dark magic. All of it arrived at the ward architecture boundary and became harmless momentum. Harry extended his awareness to the grounds, the castle's magical sphere responding to LeFay direction, the topology of the terrain shifting in the specific subtle way that magical ground could shift when directed by something sufficiently fundamental. Paths that led toward the castle became paths that led sideways. Footing became less cooperative. The formation's coordination began to degrade. Voldemort arrived at 9:47. He came alone, which said something specific about his assessment of the situation. Harry looked at what Tom Riddle's soul had been before it was everything it had become. He had spent enough time with the archive's documentation to recognize the specific frequency of it underneath the 50 years of construction. Tom, he said. The word arrived not as insult or diminishment, but as identification. The name underneath the architecture. The first killing curse entered the ward architecture boundary and became momentum. The second. The third. Voldemort's expression registered the specific, cold precision of recalculation. The thing that happened when you were very intelligent and your model of a situation had just been revised by incoming data. He stopped casting. Hermione extended curse reversal, not at a curse, but at a soul fragment. The sixth Horcrux, the one Pettigrew had not disclosed. A fragment hidden in a conjured construct Voldemort had been carrying since the French Restoration. Perceptible through soul sight as a specific coldness, sitting inside his restored form. Not large, not stable. The last anchor he had, and the one he believed was still unknown. She unmade it. This was different from unmaking a curse. A soul fragment had only existence, it was not doing anything, merely being, and unmaking something that was merely being required a different quality of curse reversal. Quieter, more like setting something down than removing it. The fragment ceased. Then, Harry applied the LeFay soul logic at its most fundamental. Not punishment, not attack, but showing. Returning a soul's complete history to its source simultaneously, every act and every consequence compressed into a single moment of absolute clarity. He did not kill Tom Riddle. He showed Tom Riddle what Tom Riddle was. The body stayed upright for approximately 4 seconds. Then Voldemort sat down in the Hogwarts grounds in the specific way that people sat down when something more fundamental than their legs had stopped working. His wand was still in his hand. He was breathing. The entity that had called itself Lord Voldemort for 50 years was not. 17 of the 22 remaining Death Eaters cooperated immediately. Bellatrix Lestrange was last, cackling at intervals throughout the preceding exchange, with the quality of someone who had been performing madness long enough that the performance had become indistinguishable from the thing itself. When the others fell, she raised her wand with the genuine pleasure of someone who found chaos agreeable regardless of which side was producing it. Hermione looked at her soul signature. Then she extended soul healing. Harry and Hermione were already outside when they arrived. They had been outside for 4 minutes, which was the time it had taken to walk from the castle's entrance to the optimal position on the grounds, close enough to the outer boundary to be visible to the arriving Death Eaters. Far enough from the castle to ensure that any exchange did not involve the student population in its immediate vicinity. They stood in the evening light in the midnight silk and silver, the void signets warm against their hands, and waited. The ward architecture that Hermione had built around their position was not visible. It had not been designed to be visible. Visible wards communicated fear, the anxiety of someone who needed a wall to feel safe. What she had built was something more fundamental, a space in which the intention structure of any incoming curse was absorbed at the moment of arrival rather than at the moment of contact, which meant that curses directed at them did not arrive as curses, but as intentions that had been separated from their execution somewhere in the 12 feet between casting and landing. The Death Eater formation broke into casting range and opened fire. Green light. Red light. Dark curses that Harry had spent 4 years identifying through soul sight and studying in the archive's records on historical dark magic, the ones that targeted the soul signature directly, bypassing body-based defenses. All of it arrived at the ward architecture boundary and became harmless momentum. Harry watched the formation. Through soul sight at full extension, 30 soul signatures resolved into individual portraits. People who had chosen this, people who had been coerced into it, people who were here because leaving would cost them more than staying. The distinction mattered. It always mattered. Not because it changed what needed to happen in the next 20 minutes, but because it would change what could happen in the years after. He extended his awareness to the grounds. The castle's magical sphere responded to Lefay's direction, the topology of the terrain shifting in the specific, subtle way that magical ground could shift when directed by something sufficiently fundamental. Not dramatic shifts, not earthquake-level movement, but the specific quality of ground that was becoming less cooperative with the people standing on it. Paths that led toward the castle became paths that led sideways. Footing became less stable. The formation's coordination, which depended on line of sight and stable position, began to degrade. 4 Death Eaters retreated before any direct engagement. Voldemort arrived at 9:47. He came alone, which said something specific about his assessment of the situation. Either he believed he was sufficient alone, or he had concluded that arriving with a degrading formation communicated weakness. He stood at the outer ward boundary with the specific quality of someone who had considered his approach carefully. Harry looked at what Tom Riddle's soul had been before it was everything it had become. The archive had documentation on the pre-fragmentation signature, and he had spent enough time with that documentation to recognize the specific frequency of it underneath 50 years of construction. Tom, he said. The word arrived not as an insult, not as a diminishment, but as an identification. The name underneath the architecture. The person underneath the 50 years of choosing. Voldemort raised his wand. The first killing curse entered the ward architecture boundary and became momentum. The second. The third. Voldemort's face, through soul sight, registered the specific quality of a mind encountering something it had no framework for, and building one in real time. Not fear. His soul signature was so far from fear that the register barely existed in it anymore. The specific, cold precision of recalculation, the thing that happened when you were very intelligent and your model of a situation had just been revised by incoming data. He stopped casting. Hermione extended curse reversal, not at a curse, but at a soul fragment. The 6th Horcrux, the one Pettigrew had not disclosed, a fragment hidden in a conjured construct Voldemort had been carrying since the French Restoration. Perceptible through soul sight as a specific coldness sitting inside his restored form. Not large, not stable. The last anchor he had, and the one he believed was still unknown to them. She unmade it. This was different from unmaking a curse. A soul fragment had only existence, it was not doing anything, merely being, and unmaking something that was merely being required a different quality of curse reversal. Quieter, more like setting something down than removing it. The fragment ceased. Then Harry applied the Lefay soul logic at its most fundamental, not punishment, not attack, but showing. Returning a soul's complete history to its source simultaneously, every act and every consequence compressed into a single moment of absolute clarity. He did not kill Tom Riddle. He showed Tom Riddle what Tom Riddle was. The body stayed upright for approximately 4 seconds. Then, Voldemort sat down in the Hogwarts grounds, in the specific way that people sat down, when something more fundamental than their legs had stopped working. His wand was still in his hand. He was breathing. The entity that had called itself Lord Voldemort for 50 years was not. 17 of the 22 remaining Death Eaters cooperated immediately. The other 5 attempted various responses, which Harry and Hermione handled with the methodical efficiency of two people who had been preparing for this specific set of contingencies and had the resources of 11 centuries of LaFey documentation to draw on. The difference between what Bellatrix had chosen to become and what nearly 14 years of Azkaban had done to her afterward was difficult to distinguish from outside. Years of deliberate cruelty and years of Dementor proximity had the same effect on a soul's surface, compressing it into its most defended form. What Hermione reached was the part that had been compressed, rather than the part that had chosen the compression. The wand dropped. Bellatrix sat in the Hogwarts grounds in the late evening light and made a sound that was not laughter. The Aurors arrived at 11:30. The castle behind them held every light, every window, every torch. The enchanted ceiling of the great hall visible through the upper windows. The building that had been recalibrating toward the LaFey frequency for 4 years simply stood, as it had always stood, as it intended to continue standing. Cornelius Fudge held a press conference on the Thursday after the Hogwarts confrontation. He had spent 4 days preparing it, and the 12 minutes of organized professional presentation it produced attributed the resolution of the Voldemort threat to ministry oversight, ministry coordination, and the decisive leadership of ministry officials. He used the word decisive 7 times. He used the word leadership 5 times. He did not use the words Harry Potter or Hermione Granger or Charter of Avalon. Harry and Hermione were in the second row. They had not been invited. They were there because the Charter's provision for LaFey heirs' attendance at any public proceeding of the ministry did not require an invitation, and a public press conference in the ministry atrium was a public proceeding of the ministry. They sat in the midnight silk and silver, and were the most visible people in the room in the specific way that things were visible when everyone in the room was aware of them and was performing the awareness of not being aware of them. Fudge got 11 minutes and 40 seconds into his 12-minute presentation before he noticed them. He recovered. He finished. He was a professional. Afterward, in a corridor outside the atrium, he approached with the specific body language of a man who had decided the conversation he was about to have required the register of collegial appreciation. "Harry," he said. "Hermione, the ministry wants to recognize your contributions, Minister," Harry said. "We're issuing the charter motion." Fudge's warmth adjusted. "Today," Hermione said, "we filed it with the Wizengamot through Gringotts' legal representation. You'll receive the formal notification within the hour." She handed him a 1-page summary. The ministry continues. It manages wizarding services, regulatory compliance, international liaison. What it no longer does is legislate or adjudicate, because those functions will be performed by the reformed Wizengamot under the Charter Oversight Council. And the Oversight Council is 9 members. Yourself as an observer if you choose. Dumbledore, Lord Longbottom. Sirius Black. 4 goblin representatives. And us. Fudge looked at them with the expression he wore when he had run out of immediate responses and was buying time through the performance of consideration. "Good afternoon, Minister," Harry said. They walked back toward the atrium. The Wizengamot debate lasted 3 weeks. The opposition argument that Dolores Umbridge made, that the charter motion was structurally equivalent to what Voldemort had attempted, replacing democratic institutional governance with personal authority, was not stupid. Hermione had been anticipating it since she drafted the motion and had prepared a response that was 17 minutes long and forensically complete. "The difference is this," she said in the Wizengamot chamber on a Wednesday afternoon. "Voldemort sought to centralize all authority in himself. The Charter distributes authority according to competence, merit, and foundational principles that predate any individual currently in this room. The Oversight Council has 9 members. No single member has veto authority. Every decision requires majority agreement. The Charter cannot be corrupted by one person's ambition because it was designed 11 centuries ago specifically to prevent that architecture. We are not establishing personal authority. We are establishing a structure that makes personal authority impossible at the institutional level. She let the silence run its full natural duration before sitting down. Umbridge made no further arguments that afternoon. The documentation of her involvement in unauthorized Dementor deployment was filed with the Oversight Council the following Monday. The Oversight Council reviewed it in a single session. Umbridge was removed from ministry service on a Friday and banned from government function on a Saturday. The charter motion passed 34 to 14. Among the 34, Dumbledore, whose yes carried the specific quality of a man completing something he had been working toward across a very long career, without knowing exactly what form the completion would take. Augusta Longbottom, whose yes had the quality of someone who had spent 14 years watching institutional failure from a very particular proximity. Sirius Black, whose yes had the quality of someone who had spent 13 years in Azkaban for institutional failure and had strong opinions about not repeating the experience. The vote closed at 4:17 in the afternoon. The winter Wizengamot session occurred 6 months into the new framework, on a Friday in December. Fudge's speech about the disruption caused by the resurrection of a 1,000-year-old legal regime was prepared and organized and not without merit as a rhetorical performance. He had a researcher who had found material on the historical context of the charter's drafting that added texture to the argument that 11th-century-old legal frameworks might require interpretation in contemporary context. He spoke for 12 minutes. He used the phrase historical precedent must adapt to modern realities 4 times. Harry listened from the visitors' gallery with the attention he gave to all things worth understanding. When Fudge finished, Harry raised his hand. Not magically, simply raised it, the gesture of a student with a question, which was what it was. Fudge acknowledged him. The ministry was founded in 1707, Harry said, in the quiet carrying tone that the gallery's acoustics and the LaFay resonance cooperated to distribute evenly through the chamber. The Charter of Avalon was signed in approximately 500 C. If democratic institutional development supersedes it, the Wizengamot should be prepared to specify which democratic process was used to supersede a document that predates the concept of the Wizengamot by 900 years. The chamber held the specific quality of silence that arrived when a question had been asked that the people being asked had not prepared an answer for. Fudge opened his mouth. His researcher, presumably, had not covered this specific angle. He closed his mouth. The chief warlock, with the considerable dignity of a man who had been expecting this moment, moved to the next agenda item. In the visitors' gallery, Sirius leaned toward Harry and said, very quietly, "That was the most satisfying 9 seconds I have witnessed in this chamber in my entire life." "It's a simple question," Harry said. "The simple questions are always the ones they can't answer," Sirius said. "That's what makes them satisfying." Hermione, on Harry's other side, was writing in her notebook with the specific speed that indicated she was pleased with how something had gone. 6 months later, the Muggle-born registry was formally abolished in a single-session Oversight Council resolution. Not modified. Not reformed. Abolished, removed from the legal framework entirely, its records transferred to a historical archive. Its infrastructure repurposed for the universal magical schooling registry the new framework required. The blood status classification system that had existed in one form or another in British wizarding law since the 17th century ceased to exist on a Tuesday in May. The Oversight Council session that accomplished this lasted 43 minutes, which was the shortest in its 6-month history, and the one that Hermione considered, privately, the most significant. She wrote 1 sentence in her notebook when the resolution passed. Done. No underlining. The word was sufficient. The reformed Wizengamot's first session under the new merit selection criteria occurred in September. Its composition included 4 Muggle-born witches and wizards, 2 goblin representatives, the first in Wizengamot history, a fact that Ragnarok received with the specific expression of a very old creature, who has been waiting a very long time for something obviously correct to become institutionally possible. 1 centaur and 1 werewolf. Remus Lupin sat in the werewolf seat with the expression of a man who had spent his entire professional life being told that his condition made him unsuitable for positions of responsibility, encountering for the first time an institution that had assessed him differently. He did not make a speech. He simply sat in the seat and participated in the session's agenda with the focused competence of someone who had been thinking carefully about these questions for decades and had a great deal to contribute. Lucius Malfoy filed his blood-tithe appeal that October, 22 pages prepared by 6 lawyers, arguing that the changed legal landscape of the post-charter restructuring created grounds for a review of the tithe's original calculation. Hermione sat on the appeal panel. She asked 4 questions, each directed at the argument's most vulnerable point: the foundational assumption that the charter restructuring had created new precedents that applied retroactively to instruments filed under the charter's original authority. The tithe was filed under the charter, she said. The charter restructuring confirmed and extended the charter's authority. An instrument filed under an authority cannot be reviewed on the grounds that the authority has been confirmed. She looked at the appeal document. The appeal is dismissed. Additionally, the filing has identified 2 calculation errors in the original tithe, both in the Malfoy estate's favor, that we had not previously caught. Correcting them produces a revised figure. She produced a document. Placed it on the table. The revised figure was higher. Draco Malfoy, sitting his Transfiguration OWL practice at Hogwarts, received Hermione's note 3 days after the appeal resolution. The tithe attaches to the estate, not to you as an individual. Your academic performance this year has been noted favorably by the Oversight Council. Regards, H.J. Granger. He put the note in his desk drawer. He did not respond. He did not know what to say. He thought about it for a long time. On the south wall of the Wizengamot chamber, a plaque was installed on a Tuesday in the 5th year of the new framework. No ceremony. No announcement. The inscription was Hermione's, the Latin of the original charter's foundational clause, rendered in the obsidian silver of the Lefay frequency. Magia non famulatur, magia meminit. Magic does not serve. Magic remembers. Below it, in English, in Hermione's handwriting transferred to stone by an engraver, who had found the commission unusual and had executed it perfectly, it took us a while to remember this. We will not forget it again. It was simply there, which was the point. September 1st, 2017, King's Cross at 10:40 in the morning had the specific quality it always had on this date. The organized chaos of families who had done this before and families doing it for the first time. The particular energy of children performing bravery at each other while adults performed composure at each other. Everyone involved in a mutual agreement to treat the ordinary as ordinary and the extraordinary as expected. Harry stood near the barrier to platform 9 3/4, with his hands in his pockets and the void signet warm against his hand. He was 37 years old. He had been the Crow for 26 years. Teddy Lupin was 11 years old and had teal-colored hair that he had defaulted to at age 4 and had never changed back, which Harry had always considered one of the clearest possible expressions of genuine personality, not performing who you were, just being it, consistently, in the color everyone could see. Remus stood beside Tonks with the particular quality of someone who knew their child was ready and was being ready in return, which was the hardest form of readiness because it required suppressing the version of yourself that wanted to make the thing smaller so it was less frightening. He was the head of the Department of Magical Welfare, 6 years into his 3rd term. Hermione arrived at 10:45. She arrived, as she always arrived, in the specific way of someone who had calculated the necessary time and allocated exactly it, no more. Because more would be waste, and waste was a category of things she had not made peace with in 37 years and was not planning to start now. She had a notebook under one arm and was already talking to Neville Longbottom, who had been Hogwarts herbology professor since 2003 and who met her at King's Cross every September 1st for administrative reasons that were legitimate and also Harry had long suspected. because Neville was someone who valued the continuity of traditions worth being continuous about. She crossed the platform with the economy of motion of someone who had been navigating toward the same person for 26 years and had the route well established. "Sirius is late," she said. "Sirius is always late," Harry said. "He is punctually late." Which is different. Sirius arrived at 10:52, which was 8 minutes before the train left, and was, for Sirius, nearly early. He was 57 years old and looked like a man who had decided that surviving Azkaban and 2 decades of post-Azkaban life entitled him to exist in whatever way felt most genuinely himself. Which in practice meant he was sometimes difficult to find at 10:40 and reliably present when it mattered. He had the specific quality of someone who had come back from something very far away and had chosen deliberately to inhabit his life rather than merely occupy it. The conversation between Sirius and Teddy lasted 4 minutes and was not overheard by Harry, who had moved away to give it the space it needed. Some conversations were between a person and the specific version of family they had assembled from what was available, rather than what was given, and those conversations deserved their space. He stood near the barrier and watched the platform. The world it contained was different from the world in which the platform had existed in 1991. Not in its surface appearance. King's Cross looked like King's Cross. The families looked like families. The train looked like the Hogwarts Express. The differences were structural, embedded in things visible only if you knew what you were looking at. A Muggle family 3 platforms over-engaged in conversation with a wizarding family, with the natural ease of people who lived in the same neighborhood and were discussing ordinary things. Because the statute of discretion had made that conversation legal and common in the 12 years since its implementation. A goblin in a suit, reading a Muggle newspaper. A ministry official whose identification lanyard listed, in the plain text of normalized institutional practice, her werewolf status alongside her departmental role. Small things. The kind of things that were invisible until you knew what their absence had looked like, and then were visible as the entire difference between 2 worlds. Harry had spent 26 years on the work that produced those small things. Not alone. The Charter had done most of it, and the Oversight Council had done the rest, and the individuals who had sat in the reformed Wizengamot, and the people who had written the Muggle-born Registry Abolition, and the legal team that had spent 3 years drafting the Magical Creatures Equity Accords, had done the specific labor of translating principle into practice. He and Hermione had provided the legal foundation and the sustained direction. The world had done the rest. The world did most things, if you gave it the correct foundation. Hermione was beside him now. She looked at the platform with the expression she wore when she was noticing things and cataloging them, which was her face's default expression, and which Harry had been reading for 26 years with the specific fluency of someone who knew every variant. "Do you remember what it felt like?" he said, walking in for the first time. "The boat crossing," she said. "I had finished the standard first-year texts in July and had started the second-year supplementary materials. I was annotating them. And then the castle came into view, and I stopped annotating." "You stopped annotating." For approximately 40 seconds. A pause. It was the first time since I was 7 that I had stopped annotating something because the thing itself was more interesting than my analysis of it. Harry looked at the barrier. I pressed my hand against my chest. On the boat. Because I could feel it, and I didn't have words for it yet. "You had the words," Hermione said. "You just hadn't used them for that purpose before." This was the kind of thing she said. The kind of precision that was not correction but completion. The specific quality of someone finishing a thought you had started, because the thought was as much theirs as yours after 26 years of thinking alongside each other. He had stopped noticing where his analysis ended, and hers began approximately 15 years ago, which was not a loss of self, but an expansion of it, the specific expansion that happened when two people had been thinking in complementary registers long enough that the registers had become a single larger one. They were not the same person. They were never the same person. He moved through structures, and she read them. He felt the shape of things, and she understood what the shapes were for. The distinction had never collapsed, which was why the resonance had never degraded. The train gave its whistle. The platform surged with the last-minute quality of departure, embraces, shouted instructions, the theatrical grief of parents performing their children's absence before it had actually occurred. Teddy Lupin was at the train door. He turned and found Harry with the specific efficiency of someone who knew exactly where to look. "The castle will know you," Harry said. Teddy looked at him. "How do you know?" "The castle knows everyone who matters to someone it already knows," Harry said. "It has good instincts." Teddy boarded. The door closed. The train began to move with the specific authority of a thing that had been making this journey for over 100 years and found the routine comfortable. Harry and Hermione watched it go until the last carriage had cleared the platform, and the steam was the only evidence remaining of what had been there. The platform emptied in the way that platforms emptied after departures. Quickly, because there was nothing left to wait for, and people who were good at things moved on to the next thing when the current thing concluded. Harry and Hermione stood in the thinning crowd with no particular urgency. In the Wizengamot chamber on the south wall, the plaque was 22 years old and had been read by every person who had passed through the chamber in that time. An enormous number of people, making an enormous number of decisions, in the building that the Lefay Charter Oversight Council had made the governing body of British magical law. The plaque did not change anything by being there, but it was there, which meant the thing it said was said in the room where the decisions were made, which was where things needed to be said if they were going to be true in the ways that mattered. Magia non famulatur, magia meminit. It took us a while to remember this. We will not forget it again. Hermione produced her notebook. This was not a decision. It was the physical expression of how her mind worked, the automatic translation of experience into record. The thing she had been doing since the moment a Gringotts audit turned a piece of parchment obsidian black in August 1991, and she had reached for her notebook before she reached for anything else. She wrote 4 sentences. Harry read them over her shoulder, as he had been reading over her shoulder for 26 years. September 1st, 2017, Platform 9 3/4. Teddy Lupin departed for Hogwarts, first year. The castle will know him. She closed the notebook. In the Heirs of Morgana archive, where 800,000 pages of Lefay practice waited in the specific patient darkness of things that had been waiting a long time and had gotten very good at it. 2 additions had been made to the collection in the preceding decade. Harry's documentation of the Wardstone projection technique he had developed for the Hogwarts confrontation, and Hermione's 17-volume theoretical framework for soul calculus, the discipline she had spent 15 years developing from the archive's foundational materials into something now taught at 6 institutions across 3 continents. Neither of them had read the complete archive yet. 800,000 pages was a great deal of pages, and they had not been in a hurry. The archive would be there. They would be there. The work was ongoing in the specific way that significant work was ongoing. Not urgent, not frantic, but continuous. The steady accumulation of understanding that was the only reliable mechanism for building things that lasted. Every year added new documentation. Every year the collection grew. They worked through it with the patience of people who had learned, early and irreversibly, that the most important things were the ones worth doing slowly and correctly. Harry looked at the empty platform. "Ready," Hermione said. Not a question. The declaration of a person who had been ready for 26 years and found no reason to stop. "Always," Harry said. They stepped off the platform and back into the city, which was the world they had been building for 26 years, and which was, in the specific, concrete, verifiable sense that Hermione required of all significant claims, better than the one they had found. Not perfect. The LeFay documents had never promised perfect. They had promised foundational, the correct architecture from which imperfect people could build imperfect things that were nonetheless better than the imperfect things they replaced. The city went about its business. The void signet was warm against Harry's hand, in the specific way it was warm when the LeFay resonance was registering something worth noting. He did not stop to identify what it was. He filed it for later, which was where he filed things that were true and not yet urgent, and kept walking. 26 years of that practice had produced a very large catalogue of things that had eventually become urgent, and each one had been better handled for the time given to it. Some things could wait. The important things usually could. The work continued. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.